wanted to share some of that with you and encourage you to think about ideas and inspirations that you have that you can share with us as well. So first wanted to just mention that that image you're looking at is very important to our work because I think whether you're interested in permaculture or a designer or a conservationist or an environmentalist, it really does come back to the fact that we do live on this big, beautiful ball of a living planet. And sometimes when we get focused in on our day-to-day lives, we lose track of that, even when we're doing things like preserving land or planting gardens. But we never want to lose sight of the planet Earth that is our home, and really the need to heal that relationship between humans and the Earth. I know that's been my calling on this planet, and I'm sure it is for many of you as well. Just get me to the point. I wanted to start off by thanking School of Living. Some of you may be familiar with School of Living, and some of you are deeply familiar with it, but I was drawn to this organization probably about 15 years ago when I was soul searching a bit in the middle of my land trust career and realizing there's a way to go much, much deeper than just saving land, just preserving farms and natural areas, and found that there were organizations like this that essentially were started, at a time of great crisis, the Great Depression, and since that time had really grew and gone through several cycles and several generations of community residents. But to this day, with the remarkable assemblage of communities between these three states that are under the School of Living, knowing that it was founded 86 years ago by people like us who have a lot of the same concerns we do about living closely with the earth, and also during a time of crisis. So it's a real honor to be back involved with School of Living as really our fiscal sponsor for this startup permaculture Living Lands Trust. So if you're not familiar with School of Living, please learn more about them. So where this idea came from, if you know Bill Mollison, I'm sure many of you do or know of him as one of the co-founders of permaculture back in the 1970s out of Australia. Not only did he inspire people around the world to think more carefully about the human role as planetary citizens and the way to act responsibly that way, but also I think he inspired a worldwide movement that even today is getting a lot more attention than it was perhaps in the 70s. And that's partly because newer generations are waking up to this design vision that came out of that time that has great ramifications for the lives ahead of us currently and in the future. So with Mollison, knowing that permaculture design manual was so influential, and the PDC courses that are taught around the world, I always ask the question, well, where are these sites being designed? Who owns the land that those sites are being designed on? Is that land secure? Does it have the kind of tenure that really is permanent tenure, just in the same way that the permaculture design is looking for more of a permanent culture? So I think those are important questions to ask, and I've been asking them for years in my professional life as a land conservation specialist. But then looking more closely at the origins of the land conservation movement, you come to a name, Charles Eliot. Now, he was a landscape architect back in the late 1800s in the Boston area, but he was really the first one to say, we have great museums for art. Let's create something like that, but really for great tracts of land that really deserve more than just what the market will give them. So he was essentially starting by preserving scenic and natural landscapes in the greater Boston area, with essentially the first conservation land trust to ever be created, and it's called the Trustees of Reservations. Started about 1891 in the Boston area. To this day, they're one of the largest and most successful conservation land trusts in North America. But when you take those powerful ideas of permaculture and conservation land trusts, and you realize that since their inception, they've never really partnered in any significant way. That's part of what inspired us to say, well, let's see what happens when they do. Let's see the synergies that we might create by bringing these two powerful movements together. And I want to condition that by saying, if any of you are aware of similar efforts where conservation land trusts and permaculture designers are collaborating in a deep foundational way, we want to learn about them. We want to network and find others doing this work. But, to say that we're the first, but we think it's a powerful idea that needs to be explored. So essentially our mission, as you've heard, is about creating this protected network of permaculture land commons by holding land in trust for communities to meet human needs within the natural limits of the ecosystems and the bioregions in which we live. This image being on the Appalachian Trail in North Carolina, north of Asheville, a remarkable area called Roan Mountain. It's just a reminder that the trail ahead is as wide and diverse as we want it to be, but especially at times of crisis like we're in now, I think we can turn to these truths that that land really can be looked at as a commons, similar to how School of Living has treated its land for these last 86 years. So what that looks like in a mind map example would be, the permaculture commons being a goal, that land essentially can be liberated from private ownership. Land can be liberated from public property and can essentially become more just the earth. When I speak to classes about land conservation, I sometimes ask, when was the first time that you remembered land being taught to you as property? So when was the first time you understood that somebody actually owned land? And if you're like me and like many others, you may remember running around as a kid outdoors in neighborhoods and not really even knowing that that was property. It was just outdoors. It was just land. It was just nature. But sooner or later, someone might have yelled at you to get out of their garden or off their lawn. And that's that stark wake up for the child mind, or really any human mind, that land is property in many ways, but it hasn't always been that way. In fact, most of our history, it hasn't been property. So we're looking at permaculture commons as a central focus and a central goal, similar to the way School of Living has pieced together its network of commons. But thinking broadly, where do we start? At the top there is certification. So we know there are great sites out there that really deserve to be recognized for what's been created through permaculture design on those sites. And so we really want that to be a starting point to say, let's recognize these sites. Let's give them a chance to be publicized in their communities and in the regions that they're in, so that we can begin to piece together really a global network that fits a definition of more of a permaculture commons, or at least the potential for one. And then secondly is the idea of protection. So similar to a conservation land trust that secures land through conservation easements, even though the land is still privately owned, we see that as a great opportunity for a land trust like Permaculture Living Lands Trust to essentially find sites that have been designed and implemented as permaculture sites, but that may not have any protection to speak of and really are worthy of it, even though they may not quite fit the definition of a standard land trust criteria, such as preserving a large working farm or preserving a diverse natural area. These permaculture design sites may not rise to the top of the list for the typical local land trusts that you may be aware of, but Permaculture Living Lands Trust is definitely designed to look at these sites as valuable resources. And then finally, long-term stewardship. We know that stewarding permaculture sites can take place, especially if we take an acquisitional approach and long-term management approach. So there's some great examples out there of organizations like the Nature Conservancy working all over the world as one of the top conservation nonprofits anywhere. However, their approach has been to acquire land for biodiversity, for habitat protection, but really not for community benefit. And we feel there's a great correlation between that approach and one that is much more community oriented and the one that does follow the worldwide movement of permaculture in terms of actual acquisition of land, either through gifting or some form of purchase. So what does that look like at a more specific example? Um, Andrew, I'm hoping is on our call now, but his site where he manages 14 acres up in Ellenville, New York, is an excellent example of a site that's been designed with permaculture principles since about 2008. It's a teaching center, it's a demonstration site. It's really the kind of place that I would say fits the bill for a site that you would definitely think is worthy of certification as you know, the very first site that I could think of that I would point to say, this is what we're talking about when we want to see a network of certified permaculture sites around the world. So not to say that there aren't other certification programs, but this is one example that we feel we could start with. And that could include some form of community publicity, some form of a small ceremonial gathering, a celebration, publication in local newspapers and social media, but just to recognize that permaculture is happening in places that people may not even be aware of. So think about your communities. I mean, School of Living offers other great examples that if we're trying to think about regions, then we've got New England here as an example for Andrew's site, the Center for Bioregional Living. The Mid-Atlantic region, there could be any number of a School of Living sites or others that could be certified. And then where I live down in the Southeast, definitely some other examples. So thinking globally though, at some point we would love to say that we've certified permaculture sites on all of the 7 continents and if they exist, and also in countries around the world. But the other example, the second example I mentioned of protection of permaculture sites, this one is hypothetical because we aren't really in operation quite fully yet. But an example from where I live might be in the Charleston, South Carolina area. If we know of a site that has a food forest, we're calling it the Sea Islands Food Forest, just as an example. It might be a 28-acre site that someone has been spending the last 5 years actively planting with edible fruit and nut crops, as well as understory species. So thinking of that as something that might be privately owned, might be an individual who's very interested in seeing their land protected permanently so that those trees may have their full life cycle and that future generations may benefit from them. But the local land trust in that area may not have an interest in that type of conservation easement. It just might be a little out of their priority list when they're trying to focus on coastal wetlands and scenic working farms, for example. So in this case, we would be very interested in a site like that. And my experience in running land trusts, I would say it would be a very straightforward process to work with the landowner, develop a concept that's tailored specifically for permaculture design sites like this. And the idea then is that after that land is protected, anyone could come and see this example 20, 30, 80, 90 years down the road, and it would still be there with no homes, no clearing, just those fruit and nut trees and understory species thriving or being replanted as needed. So that's really an example where even if there was a home site included, that land would largely be protected. And then finally, the third example about stewardship of these sites is important. Another hypothetical example, some of you are very aware of the nut and fruit tree nurseries that are out there. And it's, the more I learn about it, it's just a remarkable movement of growers and nursery men and women who have a passion for these species, especially those that are natives that may be hybridized to have beneficial qualities in terms of edible fruits and nuts. And knowing that some of these nurseries and nursery owners are now aging out, reaching their 70s, their 80s, what will happen to these sites? Will these sites then be put on the open market, perhaps sold to another nursery operator or not, or will they be permanently protected? Again, it's not a great example of a fit for a typical conservation land trust. I don't know of very many nurseries that have conservation easements on them, but it would be an excellent example of the type of acquisition of property that a group like Permaculture Living Lands Trust would be very interested in, especially as some of our first opportunities to acquire land. So again, whether it would be through gift or some form of fundraising campaign to purchase the land or buy it at a discount, sites like this hypothetical one in the Seattle area would be a remarkable win for not only our young land trusts, but for the permaculture community and really the community in general. Imagine living in a place like Seattle with all the struggles it's going through right now, and knowing that not only this nursery, but perhaps a whole network of nurseries like it could be um, expanded and grown to produce the kind of fruit and nut tree crops that regions like that really need for long-term food security, as well as the Vancouver region of British Columbia, not far to the north. So excellent opportunities all over the country like this that we want to take a closer look at, and we'd be happy to talk to anyone here who knows about those opportunities. But when we come right down to it, from this example, the permacultureglobal.org worldwide network map, it really is remarkable how this movement has spread internationally. So we know these permaculture sites, wherever we look, are going to have different types of land tenure, different types of ownership. Some may be on private land that's already permanently paid off. There are others that might be on private land that has some level of debt in the form of mortgage or loans that need to be repaid. Some of it may be on leased land or corporate owned land. So really remarkable when you ask that question of what is the land tenure for all of these hundreds and hundreds of sites around the world. And can there be solutions that a land trust like Permaculture Living Lands Trust could help provide, especially to the sites that really are making a difference in their communities? So what it would look like, these are again just hypothetical examples, but I'm sure you recognize some of these images, whether it's North America with the famous nut tree farm in the Midwest. That could be an example where I don't know what the land tenure is, what the ownership is for that Mark Shepard operation, but whether it's that property or something like it, I would always want to ask, is it secure? Will that site be there 150 years from now producing? And is there a better way that that land could be owned or protected so that there's a guarantee that it will be? So permanent protection for permaculture is really part of what we're looking at. In South America, some of the eco-village designs that are truly remarkable, again, are they owned as more of a condo or homeowners association or some other form that may be a less stable legal structure to guarantee that that site will be stewarded generations into the future, as well as Africa, as well as Europe, Asia, Australia, even David Holmgren's site. I'm sure people may know, but I don't know, is that site privately owned? Is there any conservation measures in place? It's truly a remarkable leading example, but are sites that he has worked on or that he owns, are they permanently protected so that they can be here for generations? So those are the types of questions that we're asking. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the design principles and the design ethics, but the whole idea of care of earth, care of people, and fair share keeps coming back to, can we really consider land to be property in a permaculture design framework? And I think that's a very good question to ask, because permaculture asks for something deeper in my mind than what the private real estate market can offer. So you've heard about Andrew and his background. He and I got to know each other probably in the mid-90s when we were both working in Southeast Pennsylvania. I was working to preserve farmland in the Brandywine Valley there with the Brandywine Conservancy. He was teaching at an alternative school called Upatinas, and basically asked if he could bring his students out to one of our conservation sites to plant trees along a stream. And I thought that was a remarkable requests, since most land trusts don't typically get those requests, but we were more than happy to work with him, and we've been friends ever since. And so I want to impress upon you that these ideas have been brewing and bubbling from an educational permaculture standpoint, but also from a conservation land trust standpoint for many years. And the fact that we're now here, gosh, what is it, 25 years later, practically, it's remarkable that that he and I are now having that chance to work together on something very tangible that we hope will be here long after we're gone. So that's some of my background that you've already heard about. And Lisa DiPiano, unfortunately, I don't believe is going to be with us on this call, but we're very proud to have her as a co-founding board member as well, due to the work that she's been remarkably influential up in the Massachusetts area with UMass Amherst, and being a permaculture designer in general in the Northeast. So glad to have her on the team as well. So one thought I wanted to just leave you with for this section of our presentation, it has a lot to do with the commons and the enclosure of the commons. And I don't include lots of word slides here, but these images say a lot. You know, those old peasant paintings from the old world of Europe, really these were at a time, or showing a time, that often predated the idea of private property. In many cases, these were lands that were owned collectively or communally in villages and country areas outside of villages, or they were part of royal holdings, but really the commons was a central part of the land tenure there. So when we come to the idea of private property and really even deeds being on property, a deed being just a piece of paper that states a claim to that land, those deeds don't really even appear in the English language until about the 1400s, I believe, or the 1500s, which is right about the time when the enclosure movement really began in Europe. So as early as the 12th century, there were parts of England that were starting to be enclosed, where the commons was suddenly acquired, taken, granted by kings, etc., to monarchs. But that really started a movement that by about the 15th century, and then especially right up through the Industrial Revolution till about 1900, there were thousands of enclosure acts passed in England. Millions of acres that had been hunting, farming, firewood collecting land for commoners was suddenly private property. And many of the great challenges we face today in terms of disparities in wealth all around the world have their roots in that enclosure movement of common land becoming private property. So the fact that we're only talking about a 500-year history of ownership, and the fact that organizations like School of Living have been around for almost 20% of that time saying, no, land truly is held in trust. We can hold land in trust. That's what inspires me. I think that's what inspires Andrew and Lisa and others to say, well, why do we just accept that land is property? That's not the answer here. There's a bigger answer out there, which is about returning land to its rightful place, where there are no deeds, there are no pieces of paper that say it belongs to one person and not another. So where I come from in Southeast Pennsylvania, my dad's side of the family were early settlers, and I know they had tracts of land where I have deeds that go back to the 1700s. But you wonder, before that deed from 1717 for 460 some acres of land in Chester County, Pennsylvania, what was that land? It wasn't deeded to anyone. It was a woodland commons for Lenni Lenape Native people. And it was only when William Penn was granted, I think it was the largest private holding ever in the history of humanity. It was something like 45,000 square miles given to him by King Charles II. That gift, which really was no one's to give in the first place, really started an immediate subdivision process, as you can see here on this map. So Penn gets there in 1682. This is 5 years later, literally subdividing the entire countryside around Philadelphia, you can see in the lower center there, that's the old native village of Shakamaksin, which is now Philadelphia. But all this countryside, it was just wilderness, completely subdivided and sold off. So, and essentially, William Penn's Woods, that idea of property was ingrained in the settlement of this country. And really, he was probably one of the largest real estate developers in history. Fast forward to the Homestead Acts of the 1860s and 1870s. This is a famous scene, one of the first photos of a land rush. This is the Oklahoma land rush. So not only had native people been killed off or killed with disease or moved to places like Oklahoma, where a lot of the Lenape were moved, but then they were forced off that land through Indian wars. And so here were people rushing across the prairie to stake their claim on 160-acre gridded plots that they were there for the taking. So again, the commons becomes private property. It's deeply rooted in our DNA as a nation, and I think it's time to question that. Fast forward again to the new colonialization, the new way that we are recommodifying land around the world, and we look at what's called farmland investing. So whether you're part of Harvard University and your money is sitting in their $24 billion endowment or whatever it is now, some of that money is being invested in one of the largest funds for acquiring land around the world. So if you look on the left where the USA shows that large orange spike, that's where the investment source comes from. The pools of money are coming out of those large orange spikes in the US, in Malaysia, UK, but then the yellow spikes that go down show where that money is being invested. So places like Eastern Europe, places like Brazil, Indonesia, where you see the horrific palm plantation clearing, that's where this money is ending up. So it's a new form of commodification of the commons. It's a new form of colonialization. And even other pools of capital like TAA Craft, the large fund for retired teachers, they have a pool called Nuveen, which is probably the biggest land investment capital fund in the world, with something like 970 billion in assets, 500 properties, 7 countries. So when we think about that, think about different types of investment in lands, and what we're talking about is a much different model that's about returning land to the commons rather than capitalizing on even more of it than we already have. And what does that capitalization look like? These are some of the images that disturb me the most. So you see a Sumatran rainforest in Indonesia converted to thousands of acres of palm plantations so that we can have cookies that have palm oil in them. You see native people and uncommunicated tribe, or an uncontacted tribe, literally firing arrows at a helicopter hovering above their village in the Amazon as it's on the way out, being cleared. You see horrific images of an orangutan fighting with a giant earth mover that's destroying not only its home and its family home, but the entire ecosystem, the entire biodiversity on which it represents. So if I were that orangutan, I would be fighting back as well. It's horrible to watch that footage, as well as in our own country, on the Lakota reservation, seeing in South Dakota the militarization of our police force, once again taking native land for corporate benefit. So the commons is still under siege, and anything we can do with Permaculture Living Lands Trust to begin putting the pieces back in place so that these scenes don't have to reoccur and that there can be a new model, I think that's partly what we're all about. So in these top images, seeing the stability and the connection to land that are in many parts of the world still, and then what that level of investment does, what that level of commodification does. If you buy 24,000 acres of farmland in Tanzania to grow produce for the European market, those people in those villages are going to end up in some of the largest squatter settlements in the world. And that's just not the way I want to see this planet go. And that's why we're doing the work we're doing. So as the 7.7 billion of us keep reproducing and keep expanding, the challenge is on us to say, what can we do with our relationship to land, with our ownership of land, to restructure some of how this works? And one of the most exciting examples I've seen is from Rosemarie Morrow, who wrote the excellent Earth User's Guide to Permaculture. Her latest effort is really about refugees and permaculture. And so when we think of Syria, when we think of places where just thousands of people are in some of the largest refugee camps in the world, part of what's going on there is that their status as human beings is tied to the fact that they no longer have a homeland. They're literally wandering souls, and the fact that they're just disconnected from land is criminal. And she's taken the large vision of bringing permaculture into refugee camps so that people may empower themselves to literally redesign their home environments. And many of those places end up being home for many, many more years than they should be. So great inspiration from people like Rosemary Morrow. But I would ask, where do they go after the refugee camps? How can we, as Permaculture Living Lands Trust, not only recognize permaculture sites around the world, not only protect them, but if we're going to steward them, can we be stewarding sites that eventually become new homes, new permaculture homes for refugees? I think that would be another excellent example of why we're doing this. So thank you for wanting to learn more about our mission, and this is some of our contact information. And I think Andrew's able to join us for some more examples of how this really can work in the communities where all of us live. But if there are questions, feel free, Jerome, at any point to chime in.
It looks at this moment as if Andrew is unable or has not been able to connect to the session. I'm not sure exactly what happened. If anybody has questions at this point, if you could either raise a hand or send a note in the chat and we'll unmute you. I did get a note from Zach Effers that says we need to save Parker Cobble's land in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, one of the best native hickory nut farms in the world, and he's 80 years old. So let me unmute Zach for a moment and he could speak to that. Zach, you should be unmuted.
Hello?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, just throwing that idea out there. Parker Coble's a good mentor and friend of mine, and I've learned a lot about hickories from him. He's only got about an acre and a half in Gettysburg. His land was part of the original William Penn grant.
Wow.
It's like a chestnut log cabin, but it's covered up with white wooden siding, so you wouldn't know. But yeah, he's got probably 200 cultivar nut trees. I mean, he's got 3 properties. That's the challenge. But just in Gettysburg, I'm trying to think how many he has. Probably like 80 or something like that, or 100. And he's battled cancer 3 times, and he doesn't. I mean, he's got kids and grandchildren, and I think they're pretty well off, but they're not really interested in what he's doing. And you know, it's a pretty common story, and he doesn't really have a real plan for, you know, what happens after he dies. I mean, I'd like to take it on if I had the means to, and at the moment I don't. But yeah, I don't really know what the property's worth and, you know, all that. But it'd just be a good thought, you know, especially for our bioregion. Preserving that would be really, really important, in my opinion.
Okay, it looks like Andrew has joined us.
Well, let's see if David has a response.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Zach. I know you and I haven't met yet, but I'm definitely hoping to get a chance to visit up there in Pennsylvania. And that sounds like exactly one of those sites that there has to be a future for, and we want to help figure that out. There's no reason it should just go by the wayside or get sold off to the wrong person. So yeah, let's put our heads together on sites like that anywhere. Even though we're in process and information, some of these conversations can take a while, and sometimes just having an agreement in place so that the right strategy can be put together is a starting point. And if there's no agreement and no strategy, then all bets are off in terms of what will happen to a site like that.
Okay, I'd like to, at this point, turn over the session to Andrew. Let me unmute him. I think Andrew's muted himself. I can't unmute him. Oh, there we are. Andrew.
You're not immutable?
You're definitely mutable, and now you're immutable. Okay.
Am I with you?
Yeah, you're with us, and now we need to shift over to your screen presentation. So if you want to get that going.
David can take off.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that way David can take his down. Good.
So how are folks doing?
Okay, I think you need to full screen your view.
My view?
Yeah, your display is only showing as a partial screen.
That's actually David's. He's still screen sharing.
Oh, he's still, okay.
I can't share mine yet, folks. I will be with you visually.
Okay. I should be able to stop him if he can't.
Yeah, I think I did.
There, okay, so.
There we go. Excellent.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to mute David, and Andrew can now begin.
All right. Well, thanks, folks, for gathering together to talk about what it is that we can do to make the earth a more hospitable environment for ourselves and for future generations. I'll say that I'm going to focus on how what we're doing is about a new emerging kind of form in land trust that David and I have been working on for a number of years now, and we're excited to share with you the real underlying vision and mission that we have, which is really grounded in this idea that is at the core of permaculture, which is how can we combine human activities on the planet with what it is that we know helps the planet to provide us with a good life. And hearkening back to with School of Living and Helen and Scott Nearing and coining the term the good life, I would say in many senses in my association. It's about understanding that we can redesign how we do things that we call typically in this society farming or gardening, and realizing that is a human cultural act. It's an act that creates the landscapes that we live within. So we can redesign how it is we farm, how it is we garden, how it is we live, to pay honor to how it is that the water cycle works, and recognize that it's really a precious gift to have fresh water. Fresh water is so rare on this planet, literally, as we're looking at here in this slide, like 1% of all the water on the planet, even though we call it the water planet, and even though you might get some spurious notions that desalinization is a viable option, which it completely is not. The deflocculants and the chemicals that they use in that type of technology are contaminating and destroying the Red Sea and the habitats around different countries that have resorted to desal in a big way. So don't let technology fool you. We need to cooperate with the cycle that brings about that fresh water. And the Permaculture Living Land Trust is about a watershed-based understanding of how conservation work needs to dovetail with the need to create better food security, energy security, overall economic resiliency, and I've started doing some analysis here and looking at things like, how many square miles is the entire land area that the Hudson River drainage occupies? About 14,000. It's about 8,916,000 acres of land. And what we're going to look at here is a little bit of a case study where we're discussing how does the Permaculture Living Lands Trust approach a given bioregion, ecoregion, and the real broad scale concept that we're working on is increasing food availability, diversity, as well as redesigning altogether how it is that we farm, how it is that we garden, so that it is more place-based. It's more about food production that will be supporting the local population, not so much about export versions of agriculture, and growing food in a way that cooperates a lot with trees and forest ecologies. So the reason for the Rondout watershed is because the Center for Bioregional Living, where Adriana and I live in Juniper, and I'm raising a family and doing an educational center here, and David and I have been discussing for many years, how do you begin to approach planning in a way that combines the real strengths of conservation and of the ability to begin to protect land with the need to create a food basket that supports people for many generations to come. And so here what we're looking at is the Rondout in the Ulster County, and looking at just a few numbers of how much acreage it occupies. So it's a sub-watershed of the Hudson. It's about 1,100 square miles of land area. It's about 719,000 acres of land. And that becomes relevant as we explore how much acreage would it take to provide all the food for all the people who live in the Rondout, as a case study, as an example of a regional retrofit plan that the Permaculture Living Lands Trust is advocating for, this broad scale concept of agroforestry, agroecology, regional food security, and redesigning altogether how we do agriculture in ways that are championed here in these quotes by the United Nations in a 2015 food security document that they put out, where the UN is saying the world needs a paradigm shift in agricultural development from green revolution to an ecological intensification approach, which is another way of saying agroecology, agroforestry. And when we look at agroforestry, what we're particularly excited about is the opportunity to bring some of these real unique selected heritage breeds of nut trees into the broader landscape mosaic of reforestation projects in watersheds. And the required transformation is a lot more than just something like, let's continue with annuals as usual and just push the pedal to the floor and genetically engineer the 4 crops that provide 60% of the world's food right now, which is rice, wheat, soy, and corn. And when you look at these insane and inhuman landscapes that are created by this industrial import-export economy, it turns out that these local landscapes where we live actually don't provide us with any of the food that we're eating in the main. 90% of the food that people are eating comes from outside of where they live. And that means they are food insecure. They are not in direct control of where it is that the basic necessities of life come from. The costs of industrial agriculture. Here we're looking at a map of the United States, and atrazine contamination of drinking water, which is widespread throughout the country, and especially in the places where we see chemical industrial agriculture being rampant. And this is clearly, it's a synergistic carcinogen that causes other chemicals. It's estimated your average American has something like 52 different synthetic chemicals coursing around their bloodstream. And atrazine is not a friendly player when it comes to the cocktail and how it ends up causing your body to react to other carcinogens. In other words, it exacerbates it and makes you about 10 times more likely to contract cancer from a carcinoma. These costs are important because many land trusts, many organizations don't actually roll out what it is that we're up against and why we need a systemic broad scale change that is at the baseline organic and then adds to that this perennial agroforestry, agroecology, nut heritage preservation, and watershed master planning for food security so that we don't continue to create Superfund sites and atrazine fallout zones while we feed people. This is unacceptable, untenable, and at the very least, unsustainable. It's surprising to me, constantly astounding to me as an educator, how few fellow educators bother to systemically analyze what is going on in this country and share it as a foundation of the work that we're doing. And it's part of the work of the Permaculture Living Lands Trust is to address this legacy of a system that basically endorses the notion that we can have 37% of our rivers and streams in this country in such a state of pollution and contamination that it also turns out we know entirely how to keep from happening, which is just the most rudimentary enactments of a clear attention to better riparian ecologies, as well as enforcing the Clean Water Act at all the sewage treatment plants, in addition to some renewable ecological wastewater systems that we're going to be looking at, that we're advocating due to this full regional approach of the land trust. We want to adapt agriculture to topography and to water, and we need to make agriculture something that actually has restorative, regenerative, ecological benefits in how it's being done. You know, still the best solar collectors on the planet are trees. And when you plant trees like black locust that we're seeing here that are planted on the edge of this is in particular a farm where I learned a lot of the integrated methods with biodynamics and heritage breed sheep here. This is Camp Hill Village, Kimberton Hills Camp Hill Village, 425 acre property where I learned a lot of things in the 90s doing volunteer work with my high school kids from Apatinas. The same students that I brought to Julian Woods and brought to Birthright Center, as well as Heathcote. Learned a lot of things. These kids got out to farms to see how to live, got out to learn how it is that we grow food in ways that combine trees, combine livestock, and combine natural building. Here's a property where we did a design and an install in the Buck Run drainage in Chester County, Pennsylvania. Here's the plan. So this is the field. On the right-hand side in this photo are the nut tree grove that we recommend planting. And then we also installed a whole vegetable garden that shows the appropriate use of tractors to begin to meet that demand for $600 million worth of produce that's been measured to be desired by people who live within the Hudson Valley. This notion of appropriate use of technology and showing how to set up production that is on a market scale and is enabling you with machines to bring in a lot of ground that then can be maintained thereafter with hand tools and mulches, natural materials, cover crops, and so forth. Here we're looking at a nut grove. This is Fayette Eggers. This is in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And this is an example of another thing that in the time that we've been working on the Permaculture Living Lands Trust, I've become more and more aware of the fact that there are these legacy plantings of nut trees that are not just any old nut tree. These are trees that have been grafted and they're 40 years old. And when you look at the potential to plant out whole landscapes with these legacy plantings, you begin to understand what it is that David and I are so excited about, with having the status to be able to have people donate land and teach people how to farm and garden on these properties in a way that introduces these genetics of many of these grafted, selected varieties of northern cold hardy hickhans and shagbark hickories, and adding immense food value that's perennial and really arguably lasts for many, many decades and generations to come. Here we're back at the farm in the Buck Run drainage. You know, it turns out that really generally new farms tend to be small as far as most analysis done by USDA and done by independent NGOs, Cornell and Co-op Extension. It also turns out that according to a recent University of New Hampshire study that was done for New England, it would only take about 16 million acres of land to grow all the food for all the people in lower New England, which is about 14.5 million people. Yet only about 12% of the food that people in that part of the country consume is grown there. This is at Garden to show you a sense of what diversified market scale vegetable gardening that we want to train people in, this method that's high yield, high production, and informed by many years of studying biodynamic, organic, and taking it a step further. So when we conserve land, we train people in these methods. And we set up farms that give people an outline of a design along with the easements that we want to construct. According to the Cornell study, fresh markets make considerably more as a farm when you grow fruit and you grow crops that you're going to sell that are diversified. You make more per acre than when you grow single crop conventional farm operations. We're paying a lot of attention in our recommendations with rainwater being incorporated into the farm design, into the land design. Here's a 2,100 gallon rain tank that we put in at a farm where we also installed on contour beds that we shot with laser levels to make sure that they were swale in nature. And then we're training students here in these photos how to apply compost that comes from a local operation, beginning to really focus on the details of how you train people up in using local, organic, natural materials to produce high quality, resilient food systems. Huge demand. You know, New York State is ranked, and overall in the Northeast, we've got high numbers like this, #3 in the nation for the total number of acres dedicated to organic growing and certified organic farms. So now the next step is to add in these nut tree cultivars, add in these diversified tree crops along the borders, along the edges, in the riparian areas, and put them under easements that enable people to harvest from them and hike in them for generations to come. It also turns out that small local organic farms give more to food banks than large monocrop farms do. Here's a farm that I've been studying for about 5 years, taking students there and visiting them every growing season. This is called Four Winds Farm. They're in Gardner, New York. They are a no-till tractor farm. That's 4 acres total. 2 of the acres are in a CSA that Jay calls Second Wind, because he got tired of running the CSA and uses it as a farm incubator where he allows people to do a barter with him for using his equipment and his space to have access to 2 acres of his land that he wants to keep in production so that he can every 2 years change where it is he's growing his heirloom tomatoes, which are his main cash crop that he makes about 160 to 200,000 a year on, and switch up the 2 acres of where the CSA is to be where he had the tomatoes, and he alternates that. He grows a lot of potatoes, he grows a lot of garlic, And he creates his own compost on site from cows that he raises for beef cattle, and creates a NOFA certified compost that he creates from his own animals and his own property. And he has an earth bermed passive root cellar for all of his cold storage that Jay estimates paid for itself within 2 years of time, because the whole facility only cost $120,000 to build. We need to build more systems like this, more infrastructures like this, and we need to borrow people who have this expertise to consult and advise on the projects that we're going to be installing on permaculture land trust properties. We're going to teach people how to use fossil fuel powered machineries to increase biodiversity, increase ecological health in the landscape. Here we're looking at a pond that we created shortly after it was dug on our property in Ellenville at the Center for Bioregional Living. And we show students how to identify springs, how to create ecologies and water reservoirs in places that were simply a field and a damp, muddy spot, and were certainly not tappable, usable, nor accessible for irrigation before we found the location and then created the pond. And this is a skill that I've developed over decades of time in property analysis, is showing both how to identify where this will be successful and how to use hand tools or machinery to achieve something that's appropriate to the scale and the area where the water is emerging. Teaching people, training people up, really giving this diversity of access to permaculture ways of understanding and seeing the world is something that we've also developed quite a lineage in, I could say. Honestly, this is me teaching a class in New York City, in Brooklyn. Realistically, we have well over 500 students who have studied with us in the last 13 years in New York City, in a course that we offer twice a year. That's a 72-hour curriculum that we've created there that is urban focused, regional focused, and part of why I'm passionate about the work of the Permaculture Living Land Trust is this real sense that I have that people are very interested in a different direction of growth. Here's another student, and training them in these practical skills is part of what our land trust wants to have more sites in addition to what it is I've been already able to achieve as a private consultant in terms of student training. I've begun to see the limits of that and have focused more on this structure that David and I are creating with the land trust so that we can begin to have many more sites that we protect, put under easement, and use as training and education centers to create a new wave of farmers, growers, and producers to begin to help populations become more food independent and energy independent. Trees are a major focus, bringing in an understanding of polycultures and perennials and food-bearing trees, as well as trees for firewood and trees for building materials. Focusing on techniques that use local compost and materials that are accessible to people in urban areas who need to grow food for populations on sites where the local soil is not safe or something that you want to be growing edibles in. Here we're looking at raised beds that we've developed here at the Center for Bioregional Living that many of our students replicate and build in their urban gardens. Here we're teaching. This is Lisa DiPiano, educating young and interested and many age-ranged people who are here in our classes learning about co-ops, learning about the agroforestry techniques, and learning about how land trust can be very instrumental in creating more local food security. Training people on how to design is an important part of what our land trust is interested in, and has this ambitious notion that not only do we need to be involved in conserving land, we also need to be involved in actually redesigning altogether how it is that we grow food and how it is that we produce energy and how it is that we're living in the landscapes where we reside. Solar thermal is another technology that we want to bring into the mix with the programs and the sites that we develop. Again, tree crops, here we are with another friend and colleague. This is John Paul, who runs Mandala Gardens. This is Clay, graduate, students who are visiting, families who we invited to learn about planting chestnut trees, the bur oak, persimmons, as well as apple and peaberry and other nitrogen fixers like the black locust. Here I am at a site. John Hershey planted these bur oaks in front of the Quaker meeting that I attended and grew up and went to for many years of my life. And I was completely astounded to realize that there was this rich lineage of grafted, selected, and developed genetics for incredible eating and food security that were all around this site and are unprotected, completely unknown for the most part by the people who live there. And these trees, here we are at his actual homestead in Guthriesville, and you see that line on those trees is a sign of where they've all been grafted, and we're looking at a chestnut grove here. And part of, again, the real inspiration and passion here for Permaculture Living Lands Trust is to create some way in which we can protect sites like these as we find them, and to plant out more and more of these genetics in places where they are protected from the beginning. Building with natural materials. This is a structure that we built based on a lot of things I learned from my homesteading experience and exploring ecological design in a way that's very site-based. Here's my right-hand business partner in my consultation business with natural building, Jeff Gagnon. We're doing a poured slab here where we do solar thermal hot water into the slab and teaching people about these technologies and incorporating them on the properties and the infrastructure we develop with the Land Trust as part of our focus. Because it really shows a new economy that's based on local, natural building methods that are powered by renewable energies. We've really developed some pretty innovative and cutting edge systems that are whole home energy and design systems that will be part of what it is that we will be able to further the expansion and usefulness of through the structure of what the Land Trust is making possible for us. Here is the seminal project from which all this building knowledge emerged. This is my homestead in West Virginia that I built. This is a straw bale house that is non-load bearing straw bale. And from building this structure, I've then been able to train up people on how to do this in my programs in New York City, who are now, we're on our 4th house for clients up here that we've built in Ulster County. Redesigning farms to be ecologically restorative. Here's a property that we did a design for in Fort Plains, New York, in the foothills of the Catskills. It's about a 60-acre property, and I think it is a nice example of the kinds of diverse retrofit methods that we will be implementing on property after property with the Permaculture Living Lands Trust. We will be showing how to do methods like silvopasture, showing how to expand riparian buffers, also how to continue to do high quality, high density vegetable production, greenhouse production, and using a lot of rainwater and adapting what we're doing where on the property to make sense in terms of slope, aspect, and drainage. We want to combine livestock with nut trees and restored ecosystems. Sounds like a pretty simple sentence to articulate, but for some reason, a complex concept to get across to many of the existing parties that are involved in conservation work, as well as the parties that are involved in restoration ecology work. They seem to be in very different camps, as well as the populations that are involved in the organic farming movement. They all are sort of siloed. The organic farming movement is focused a lot on annual vegetables, often in the floodplain with not much respect or appreciation for riparian buffer zones. We then have the world of restoration ecology, which doesn't think you can grow anything that you get a harvest from, or that you would do something participatory with, like rotationally grazed livestock within it. And then further, you don't have any projects in these restoration zones that focus on domesticated, cultivated, selected varieties of nut trees. So we want to combine all three of those things because there's beauty and strength and resiliency and diversity and an eco-complexity.
I wanted to jump in for a moment. The schedule is, we are starting to run out of time, so we need to wind this down shortly so we can open this up for any questions that people may have. So I just think we need to find a point where we can wrap this up, Andrew, so we can open this up.
Sure. Yeah,
Good.
absolutely. I'm just about done.
Okay,
Great timing.
good.
Yeah. So here's some more shots of silvopasture, black locust, why it is something that makes financial sense, makes ecological sense, makes economic sense, has a lot of potential to increase the amount that we're planting trees and what we're doing with them. Here's some more nut tree groves that are in Pennsylvania that we've wanted to explore ways to protect. Adapting agriculture to these bioregions and ecoregions, having more of us doing farming and gardening is the foundation of permaculture. And really adapting farms to make sense in terms of a regional retrofit. Watershed based, focusing on what it is that's possible right within our region. You know, it turns out that to go full diet year round in the Rondout, we really only need 118,000 of those 700,000 acres to grow all the food for all the people in the watershed. And that becomes really astonishing when you realize how accessible it is to go food independent as well as energy independent. We're looking at comprehensive plans. We're looking at how to connect cities to country, and in those areas, planting these nut tree groves. So as people ride their bikes along, they can go work on an organic vegetable farm. We can fertilize those farms with things that's coming from the food scraps. We can power our city, as Burlington does, on these food scraps, as well as our buses, as we do in China, and send it to living machines, which many of you are familiar with in this organization. Here's one in Vermont. So you go from a biodigester at the end to a living machine, and we can site those on brownfields. In China, about 30,000 of these biogas plants right now power 40 million homes. Great source of fertilizer, right? We need to divert these 41 million tons annually that needs to be diverted. So we need compost facilities like Vermont Compost, where we have 1,200 chickens laying 900 dozen eggs a month just eating these food scraps. We're going to create jobs. Lots of jobs, 52 million jobs. 27 million jobs in mines and on oil rigs are going to be lost. And we're going to create 52 million jobs where people work in nut groves and help move animals around. And that's how we're going to retrofit the industrial infrastructure to be more natural, more regionally self-reliant for energy and food needs, making an ecopolis, retrofitting the petropolis, bringing nature back to the city, bringing these grafted trees into these landscapes where people are riding their bikes back and forth and collecting nuts, and creating an entire master plan that helps the whole country become more regionally self-reliant. One watershed at a time. We're going to redesign our infrastructure to be more regionally adapted, self-reliant, and provide a diversity of green jobs. And that's some of the underlying work of the Permaculture Living Lands Trust, is to honor and remember our ancestors and future generations, witness, experience, and feel the awe-inspiring power of the earth, rise to a planetary perspective to appreciate the true scale of our existence. Remember and help us to design for the rare and precious life-giving gift of water and design for our cosmic inheritance. Landscapes of posterity is what it is that we want to bring about, and true long-term food security with nut trees in our riparian landscapes. Thanks, folks. Questions?
At this point, I've set it up so anybody who wants to ask a question can unmute themselves and ask the question. I'd ask one person at a time so we don't start stepping on each other. So the floor is open.
How do you get the finances in order to put the land into these trusts in the first place? Because I think we're all completely bought into the idea. So I guess how does the economics work to catalyze this into reality?
I think that's a very site-specific question, meaning each property and each scenario is going to have a different permutation to how and what are the ways in which you would find the finances. You know, in some instances, once you have nonprofit status, people donate land to you because of the tax break that they get because of the real estate value. I just walked a property with Kingston Land Trust yesterday, for instance, that's a quarry right in Kingston that was donated to them because the developer was able to get a significant write-off on their taxes for the donation because of the real estate value of the parcel.
Can you hear me? This is David.
Yep.
Yep.
We can.
Okay. Yeah, traditionally, the way land trusts acquire land is either through outright gift or a bargain sale purchase where they may raise funds to buy some of the land at a discount, or a full fee purchase where they raise the full fair market value. So I'm amazed at the fact that people still do give land away. Often it's people that don't have children, or families that may own enough land that they're not going to miss one extra parcel, or they could take a tax benefit for doing that. So it's really case by case, but I think our challenge is to be creative. And if we're in a certain county that has a certain open space funding program, that's the work I do. I want to be able to apply for and get those kind of grants so that if someone does need to be paid a certain amount and it is an important property, that we can make a case for funding to purchase it.
David, what's been your greatest challenge in having that conversation and converting people into this idea that Andrew's sharing?
Well, I think this is really still a new conversation. I think most of my work has been the traditional, preserve the farm, preserve the forest, rather than saying, let's think about, future production and landscapes that do that. So I would imagine, though, as we start, a lot of it will come back to things like riparian buffers, that people are familiar with the fact that the Chesapeake Bay or New York City watershed pays a premium to buffer and protect streams with forested plantings. And so if we can build on that philosophy and say, but let's, in addition to that, not only have natural areas as riparian corridors, but also useful plantings that are perennial plantings, that we may be able to lease land to do that, or we may be able to raise grants to get those plantings in place so that they're there for decades to come. So that's just one example, but I think the second example would be the nut tree nurseries that we talked about, that if we can begin protecting or even acquiring some of those as working businesses, they can have a ripple effect in the surrounding communities in terms of being able to influence land restoration beyond the boundaries of that one nursery.
Yeah, well, thank you that was a great answer. I mean, I guess I'm a newcomer to this conversation, but this is an incredibly innocuous idea where I think the vision can be painted very clearly. So it sounds like it's a matter of just packaging it up and getting it super clear to then begin sharing with the people who are already contributing to this kind of effort.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you don't want to start with something totally alien. It's something that we can build on the success that's already out there. So You just look around in the communities that you're working in and say, what's already getting traction in terms of conservation awareness and conservation finance, and let's try to build on that.
I'm wondering if you have considered like becoming an officially accredited land trust and kind of being involved with the Land Trust Alliance.
Huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, great question. So the land trust I ran for 5 years here in South Carolina was accredited, and we went through our second accreditation while I was executive director. So that was called the PD Land Trust in northeastern South Carolina. And so I've been heavily involved with Land Trust Alliance for many years, and they're probably one of the best umbrella organizations, as you may know, for any kind of nonprofit network. I think the challenge here is, how does this fit with the normal framework of conservation land trusts? And I would argue that it's more in the realm of community land trusts, such as School of Living, or another group I'm involved with, which is called the Agrarian Trust. So the idea that community land trusts have traditionally been used for affordable housing, where you own the house separately from the nonprofit owned land. We can reinvent what a community land trust is. And in fact, some of you may know the first community land trust really was New Communities Farm in Albany, Georgia. It was something like 5,700 acres of farmland for African American farmers who had been shut out of the farming industry in that region, started by folks at what's now the Schumacher Society. So yeah, we can take the community land trust version that's slightly different from conservation land trusts and run with it into this permaculture realm. But I would love to give a keynote speech at the next land trust rally with 2,000 people in the audience about this very topic, because I don't think it's on a lot of their radar.
Yeah, I think that people would be, you'd be surprised. I think some people, some land trusts are thinking in this direction, but in general, you're right that they are, in my experience. But I think that, like, for example, the Kingston Land Trust is engaged with, like, working in cities, and just like, and that's something that a lot of land trusts are actually looking to the Kingston Land Trust all of a sudden. So I guess what I'm saying is that, like, they're looking for leaders and different and pushing the boundaries. And so I think that the Living Land Trust engage that. You have a pretty cool interest. I mean, I'm interested to see how they would, because there's some people who are a little bit more purist with regards to, maybe native species and what, the permaculture concept of maybe not being so strict with native species and maybe, some more introduced sort of species that have a function. Things like that, it's make for some interesting conversations, I think.
Yeah, you're well said. I think you're right. And just to finish that thought, the accreditation process is probably not one that we would go for anytime soon, just because, if you know anything about it, it's heavily focused on avoiding conflict of interest situations. And I think our goal is to just get new ideas on the ground, rather than spending that much time worrying about whether someone's brother happened to be involved in a piece of land that we acquired, as long as we did it for the right reasons. But the land trust movement definitely benefits from being accredited. So we would love to partner in the right situations with accredited land trusts.
Cool.
And what do you think is the lower hanging fruit, or I guess the lower barrier? Is it converting existing land that's in land trust, or bringing it into kind of a fresh start?
Well, Andrew may have some thoughts on that, but my initial thought is, I think what we're after right now, the low-hanging fruit, no pun or pun intended, is are those sites that we know deserve better than what the market's going to give them. So rather than just taking a fresh cornfield and trying to convert it to a food forest, let's find those sites where someone's been at it for 15, 20 years doing good permaculture design. Let's recognize that site. Let's find a way to protect it, and if possible, acquire it as a community asset. But then, yeah, the bigger landscape scale would be definitely on the priority list, but maybe starting with things like just leasing land to get it installed at a landscape scale rather than trying to influence ownership of those properties or protection of those properties. But any thoughts on that, Andrew?
I would echo the idea that we're focusing on first properties that, like near term, there's a lot of phase approaches to what our opportunities are. And the near term thing that we've been talking a fair amount about and looking at are these nut trees and the different older gents who planted a lot of them. Some of you may have seen a graduate of our class, Costa Boutsikaris, has a really great film series called Woodlanders that he does. And on that, recently he did one on hickory nuts. And there was a guy in there, Parker Noble, and his property was one of the ones that Buzz had sent us as a list of places that we should start considering how to protect them, how to make them a certified site, as we're calling them, where we, as the Permaculture Living Lands Trust, both recognize the site, but also go further than that and begin to explore strategies for protection, easements, whatever we can do to begin to rally some means of those sites being, respected and honored for what they really are, which is a very rare vestige of project development that will be basically lost in the shuffle of conventional land use as usual if we don't get involved in some manner to say, how about easements that can hold on in perpetuity, where these nut groves that were planted 40 years ago by people don't just get bulldozed and turned into a parking lot, which literally I saw happen to a 70-year-old pecan tree on the corner of a street in Downingtown that a developer already had a plan that it was going to be cleared, and so it was cleared. And when you see these, it creates twofold opportunities for us to focus on near term, which is protecting existing intact vestiges that are like some of what's getting destroyed and lost, insofar as that's achievable, and then advocating for and getting more of these genetics to be planted out in new locations that are also protected and make sense in the landscape, right? So where are the places that we can plant out new plant stock that perpetuates, preserves, and further disperses this kind of plant material that we're now seeing is rare and needs some advocacy, these nut groves.
Wonderful answer. Yeah, that makes sense.
Where does your budget come from? I mean, what does your budget system look like, and where does the funding come from?
Yeah, well, we're starting from scratch, so
That's a good question.
we just submitted our first grant application to the RSF Social Finance, which is short for, it's a Rudolf Steiner inspired social finance fund out in San Francisco, and they have a seed grants program that we applied for, just a small grant to get general operating costs for things like a website and to attend some conferences and things like that. So School of Living has been an excellent fiscal sponsor in that regard. But as I look at where I've been able to raise money over the years, I feel like in this case it's going to be if we know there's a situation where, for example, a certain nut tree nursery is in danger of going under or being sold off, that's an excellent fundraising opportunity for community scale with things like community foundations, crowdsourcing, and then any grant programs that might be available. So we'll look at each one for its own merit. But when you talk about the larger organization and really having a more of an endowment to work from, that would take what I would call a major donor campaign, and I've run those, and I've done big asks and sat with wealthy people, but I think we need to build up a track record before we're able to do some of those bigger asks. But they're out there, and people would get excited about this idea.
This is Michael Land. I have a question. You talked about the land and the practices you'd like to see and financing. I'm wondering about the people that will be putting those practices into action, and the types of agreements you might be considering, and how to kind of do a long-term plan so that what you begin can be sustained over a long period of time.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, how to build, this is Jerome, how to build a stable community structure on the land. The idea of preserving it over a long period of time requires some kind of community development.
Yeah. Yeah, and school living is a great example of that, because it's always been about settling people on land. So, you know, I think the school living model is one we would have to look very closely at for certain situations. You know, we just had an opportunity to talk with a gentleman who owns 400 acres of farmland in upstate New York, and he doesn't have kids, and he's trying to figure out a strategy for that property. You know, we don't necessarily have an immediate answer there, but I would say that if everything worked out the way I would love it to, that would be an example where there would be a community of people living on that land who are earth stewards and able to carry out that vision of the permaculture design for a property like that.
Mhm.
But a second thought is working with the Agrarian Trust, and if you look them up, they're a pretty neat organization that grew out of the Greenhorns, which is a young farmers movement. So in working with the Agrarian Trust, I'm learning ways that as land is acquired through what they're calling an agrarian commons, they're essentially looking to create beginning farmer land access opportunities where farmers have been shut out from the cost of land and the access to land. So, so it may be that some of the work we're involved with just depends on who are in those communities that are looking to access land for food production, and building essentially a community from that interest.
Okay, I think it is getting late, so we'll have one more question, and then I think we'll need to end our meeting tonight. So the floor is open.
I guess what's next?
Well, if we get that small grant that we applied for, the next thing would be developing our website, getting a more serious video together that we can begin sharing. Because if you look on our Facebook page, we've literally gotten like 770 followers from continents around the world. I mean, I just got a bunch of contacts from Bangladesh and places like Madagascar. So, I mean, it's really cool when you think about conservation at a global scale with permaculture. But the simple things, the website, attending some conferences, you know, meeting with landowners who might be candidates for some of what we're talking about. I mean, all that is what's next, but just helping spread the word and build interest. I think we're going to start to shape our own strategic plan and get more people engaged just by spreading the word. And if you can help us, we would love it.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're going to have to wrap up our session tonight. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thank you.
And
Yeah.
Stay healthy.
Yeah.
And you had given your contact information in the beginning, so if people need to get in touch with you or Andrew or your website, maybe.
Yeah.
I wanted to, last thought is now is, you know, is an opening, that the crisis we're in is an opening, because people are thinking about our relationship with the earth and how did it get this bad? How did we get this far off track? So there's no better way to heal that relationship than bring land back into a commons and practice permaculture. So let's take advantage of this opening for all the right reasons instead of business as usual.
Woohoo!
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Right.